The first punch in Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer doesn't land on a jaw, it lands on your chest, because this 2026 drama-action hybrid opens with the kind of confidence you only get from a story that knows it's not really about winning belts, it's about surviving the moment after you lose everything, and from the very first minutes you can feel the movie daring you to look away, daring you to treat it like just another fight film, because it's already quietly placing grief in the corner of the ring, guilt in the opposite corner, and then it tells you, with almost cruel patience, that the real match is going to happen inside a man who can't knock out what he's done. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about what Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer actually is, because if you came for a simple rise and fall sports story, you're going to get something messier and, honestly, more human, a bruised redemption tale wrapped in the language of kickboxing, staged with the rhythm of a thriller, and carried by the kind of emotional weight that usually belongs to family tragedies, not locker rooms. Released in 2026, it arrives in a moment where audiences are kind of exhausted by invincible champions and training montage miracles, and this film seems to understand that fatigue. It doesn't ask, what does it take to become the best? It asks, what does it take to keep breathing after you've been the best? And then you're not, and the world decides you deserve the fall. The main character, Paul Hakan, is introduced as a former undefeated kickboxing champion, the sort of myth-making athlete whose name gets spoken like a warning and a promise at the same time. The film frames him the way legends get framed: crisp lights, roaring crowd, the camera worshipping his footwork, his timing, the calm violence of a professional who knows exactly how much damage he can do. But even in those early glory scenes, there's something uneasy in the sound design, something slightly off in the atmosphere, like the movie is already planting the seed that the story you're watching is built on a trapdoor. And then comes the loss. Paul, the untouchable, loses a fight not because he's outclassed, not because age catches him in a fair way, but because he's poisoned, drugged, robbed of agency in the one place he believed he had absolute control, his own body. That detail matters, because it's not just a plot twist to set the story in motion, it's the first deep cut in the film's central theme, that a fighter can be the most disciplined man in the room and still be vulnerable to forces he can't see. The poisoning reframes everything. Paul didn't just fall off, he was pushed. But the movie refuses to let that be an easy moral escape hatch. It doesn't let Paul become a clean martyr. Because after the match, after the adrenaline, after the humiliation and confusion, we get the incident that turns this story from sports comeback into life sentence. In a conflict with his opponent, heated, messy, fueled by betrayal and that raw animal panic that comes when you realize something was stolen from you, Paul accidentally causes the death of his own daughter. And I want to pause on the word accidentally, because the film handles it in a way that's brutal precisely because it doesn't let the audience hide behind technicalities. It's accidental in the sense that Paul did not intend it, but it's still the consequence of his choices, his temper, his body moving faster than his conscience, his identity as a fighter bleeding into a moment that required a father. The tragedy is staged with a kind of sickening realism. It's fast, it's chaotic, and afterward the silence is so heavy you almost feel like the movie has sucked all the air out of the theater. This is the turning point, and it's also the question the film keeps asking for the rest of its runtime. If you are the one who caused the worst thing in your life, even by accident, do you deserve a second life afterward? The story then does what many movies threaten to do but don't have the nerve to commit to: it lets Paul actually rot. Not metaphorically. Not, he drinks for 2 scenes and then decides to train again. It shows him separated from his family, shunned, carrying a public stigma that has a specific sting because it's connected to a child's death. The film captures that uniquely isolating kind of disgrace where people don't just hate you, they're afraid of you, as if your failure is contagious, as if being near you might invite the universe to punish them too. So Paul becomes a courier, which is such a smart, symbolic downgrade. A champion used to being watched by thousands becomes a man who is meant to be invisible, moving packages through a city that refuses to meet his eyes. And you can feel the way the job is chosen not just for plot convenience but for emotional texture. A courier is always in transit, always between destinations, never home. That's Paul. He's not living anywhere emotionally, he's just passing through time, delivering other people's needs, unable to deliver himself from what happened. The film's pacing here is patient, almost stubborn. It lingers on routines, the hum of a motorbike, the sweat under a helmet, the small indignities of low wages, the way people speak to him like he's furniture. And over all of this is the sense that Paul's body remembers a life his mind is trying to forget. Every time he lifts a package, you think about the weight he used to lift in training. Every time he dodges traffic, you think about the way he used to dodge kicks. It's like the film keeps reminding you that the skills that made him great don't disappear, they just become ghosts haunting a smaller life. Then the story introduces the spark of hope, and it doesn't come as a triumphant opportunity or a manager offering a comeback fight. It comes as people, specifically Vinnie Jenner and her daughter, Ririn. Vinnie is written with this careful balance. She's not a saint, not a manic pixie rescuer, not a convenient love interest whose sole purpose is to fix the broken man. She's under pressure herself, living in a world that feels like it has teeth, and she's trying to navigate threats that don't care about her intentions. Her daughter Ririn is 8 years old, and the film makes a crucial decision. It doesn't make Ririn a purely symbolic, replacement child. It gives her a personality, curious, observant, brave in the way kids can be brave without fully understanding the danger. But yes, the narrative weight is clear. Ririn's age and blood type match Paul's deceased daughter, and that's not just a coincidence, it's the story's emotional grenade. Because the moment Paul realizes it, you can see the two timelines inside him collide, the past where he failed and the present where he might be able to protect someone. And the film uses blood as both literal plot device and metaphor. Ririn has a rare rhesus negative blood type, the kind of rarity that sounds like a medical footnote until the story turns it into a reason for predation. Because in this world, something rare isn't precious, it's hunted. The gang led by Ben Turter is after Ririn because of that blood, and the movie doesn't cheapen this into a cartoonish, we need her blood for a villain cure trope. It frames it in the grimy, transactional logic of criminal networks. Rarity equals money, desperation equals exploitation, and bodies become commodities. At the same time, Vinnie is pressured by Ryan and the film smartly keeps Ryan's menace different from Ben's. Ben Turter feels like brute force, a gang ecosystem with fists and intimidation and the cold efficiency of people who hurt others for a living. Ryan feels like a different kind of trap, pressure that can be social, financial, coercive, maybe even intimate, the kind of threat that doesn't always show up with weapons but can still ruin you. The result is that Vinnie is squeezed from multiple angles, and when Paul enters their orbit, he isn't stepping into a simple, protect the kid, mission, he's stepping into a web of control, ownership, and exploitation that mirrors his own lack of control during the poisoning. That mirroring is one of the film's best structural tricks. It keeps connecting Paul's trauma to the new danger in a way that makes his involvement feel inevitable, not contrived. And here's where the movie becomes genuinely gripping even when it's not throwing punches, it turns protection into a form of penance. Paul doesn't defend Ririn because he wants to be a hero, he defends her because he can't stand the idea of failing again, because saving her becomes the only language he has left to speak to his dead daughter, because each day Ririn is alive feels like one more day the universe hasn't completely closed the book on him. But the film is careful not to present this as pure, selfless salvation. There's an uncomfortable edge to it. Is Paul protecting Ririn for her, or for himself? Is he seeing her as a person, or as a second chance wearing the face of an 8-year-old? And the movie plays with that discomfort through small moments, Paul's hesitation when he hears her laugh, the way his eyes sometimes go distant when she says something innocent, the way he overreacts to minor dangers because he's not just responding to the present, he's responding to an old wound that never healed properly. This is where the character writing surprised me. Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer could have easily leaned into melodrama, into easy tears, into characters delivering speeches about forgiveness. Instead it trusts physicality. Paul's guilt doesn't come out in dialogue, it comes out in posture, in how he stands like he's waiting for a hit he deserves, in how he flinches at kindness because kindness feels like an error. Vinnie's fear isn't just, I'm scared, it's in the way she calculates exits, the way she speaks quickly when she senses control slipping. And Ririn is written with that quiet kid intelligence, the kind of child who notices adults lying, who senses when a smile is a shield. There's a scene early on, not a huge spoiler, where Ririn watches Paul's hands that have done terrible things and beautiful things, hands trained to hurt and now trying to be gentle, and she says something simple that lands like a bell ringing in an empty gym. The film understands that sometimes children don't comfort you by being wise, they comfort you by being real, by asking questions adults can't answer. Now let's talk about the fight choreography and the way the movie uses violence, because in a film about a kickboxer, you expect action to be the selling point. The interesting thing is, the fights are excellent, but they are not glamorous. The camera doesn't turn combat into a music video. It keeps the impact heavy, the movement readable, the exhaustion visible. When Paul fights, it doesn't feel like a superhero doing combos, it feels like a man spending pain like currency. And because Paul is no longer the champion in a spotlight, many of the confrontations happen in ugly, real places, tight hallways, cramped alleys, under fluorescent lights that make everything look sickly. That choice matters because it changes the emotional meaning of each fight. In the ring, violence is a job with rules. Outside the ring, violence is a symptom. It's what happens when systems fail, when people feel entitled to take, when law is too slow or too compromised. The movie uses Paul's skill as both an advantage and a curse. He can protect them, yes, but every time he uses violence, you feel him slipping back into the identity that ruined him. It's like he's trying to build a shelter out of the very thing that burned his house down. The best action beats in this film aren't the biggest, they are the ones where Paul is clearly trying not to go too far, where he's restraining himself, because restraint is the real character development. And the film doesn't forget that Paul's body has been through hell. There's an authenticity to the way he moves now, still dangerous, still precise, but carrying damage, carrying hesitation, carrying the knowledge that one wrong move could make him a monster again. Cinematically, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is shot with a gritty beauty that fits its themes. The color palette often leans into muted tones, concrete grays, washed-out blues, sickly greens, like the city itself is tired. Then, when warmth appears, it's usually around Ririn, a little sunlight through a window, a warm lamp in a modest room, a hint that life can still glow in small places. The film's sound design deserves a special mention because it uses silence like a weapon. After traumatic moments, the soundtrack doesn't rush in to tell you what to feel. It pulls back. You hear breathing, distant traffic, the hum of a cheap fan, the click of a door. Those ordinary sounds become unbearable because they imply the world keeps going even when yours stops. And when music does swell, it tends to be restrained, melancholic, more like a heartbeat than a marching anthem. It's a film that doesn't want to manipulate you, it wants to corner you until you admit you care. Performance-wise, even without leaning on star power as the main talking point, the actor playing Paul Hucken has to carry a heavy burden, and the movie lives or dies on whether you believe this man's internal collapse. And it works because Paul isn't played as sad all the time. He's played as hollow, as someone whose emotions are stuck behind a locked door. Sometimes he's numb. Sometimes he's angry. Sometimes he's almost normal for a second, and then you see the guilt return like a shadow crossing his face. That complexity is what makes him feel real. Vinny's performance is equally crucial because she could have been written as just a plot engine, but the portrayal gives her layers, protective, exhausted, suspicious of help, yet still capable of tenderness. You feel that she's been negotiating survival long before Paul arrived. And the child actor playing Ririn, this is where many films fail. Because writing a child as a symbol is easy, writing a child as a believable person is hard. But Ririn feels grounded. She's not constantly adorable, not constantly inspirational. She gets scared, she gets stubborn, she gets quiet in a way that makes you worry. And when she bonds with Paul, it's not instant. It's cautious. It's earned in small gestures, food shared, a helmet adjusted, a bedtime moment where Paul doesn't know what to do with his own gentleness. Now, spoiler-controlled story overview-wise, the film's midsection turns into a tense push and pull as Paul and Vinny try to keep Ririn safe while the net tightens. Ben Turtur's gang doesn't feel like random thugs, it feels organized, persistent, informed, like they have eyes everywhere. That's important because it makes the danger feel systemic, not episodic. Meanwhile, Ryan Yuno's pressure adds a psychological layer that makes you question who can be trusted and what leverage people have over each other. The movie keeps raising stakes without resorting to ridiculous escalation. It's not about bigger explosions, it's about smaller spaces to breathe. And as Paul gets more involved, the question becomes less, can he fight them off, and more, what will it cost him to keep them safe? Because the film is honest, violence invites violence. Protection attracts attention. And a man with Paul's past doesn't get to move quietly for long. There's also a clever narrative rhythm in how the film alternates between motion and stillness. You'll get a tense chase, then a quiet scene where Paul sits alone after dropping off a delivery, staring at his hands. You'll get a confrontation, then a scene of Vinnie trying to make Ririn eat, her voice calm but her eyes giving away panic. That pacing might feel slow to viewers who want constant action, but for me it's the reason the film lands emotionally. The quiet scenes are where the movie proves it has something to say. They are where you realize the title, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer, a kickboxer's life, isn't about trophies, it's about the life that continues after the lights go out, after the crowd forgets your name, after your body stops being your pride and becomes your punishment. Thematically, this film is operating on multiple levels at once. On the surface, it's a thriller about protecting a child with a rare blood type from criminals who want to exploit her. Underneath, it's a meditation on guilt and fatherhood. Paul's daughter's death is not treated as a backstory tragedy you move past, it's treated like a permanent alteration to reality. The film asks what redemption looks like when forgiveness isn't guaranteed and maybe isn't even deserved. It also explores how society treats fallen icons. Paul isn't just grieving, he's being punished by public opinion, by isolation, by whispers. There's a cultural texture to that, too, because in many communities the idea of shame isn't private, it spreads. It becomes communal property. The movie captures that feeling of being watched not by cameras but by memory, by rumor, by the collective judgment of people who were never there but feel entitled to a verdict. And then there's the blood theme. Ririn's Rhesus negative blood type is rare, and rarity becomes danger. It's a bleak commentary on how people with something uncommon, whether it's a resource, a talent, a vulnerability, can become targets in a world that commodifies everything. Even Paul's body, as a fighter, has been commodified, his strength made money for promoters, his invincibility used as marketing, and when he loses, when he is poisoned, his body becomes a site of betrayal. Everyone in this film is being used by something, gangs, systems, reputations, debts. The journey, then, is about reclaiming personhood. For Paul, that means learning to see himself as more than a weapon. For Vinnie, it means refusing to be cornered into choices made by men with leverage. For Ririn, it's the heartbreaking fact that a child has to become aware of how the world looks at her body like an object. The movie doesn't preach these themes, it lets them emerge through plot pressure. And that's why it hits. One thing I also appreciated is how the film treats masculinity. Paul is a fighter, yes, but the story doesn't romanticize stoicism as strength. It shows that his refusal to process emotion, his default to anger, his instinct to solve problems physically, those traits have consequences. The tragedy with his daughter exists because he couldn't step out of fight mode. So the film's concept of growth isn't learn a new technique, it's learn a new way to exist. There are scenes where Paul is forced to do non-heroic things, apologize without being forgiven, walk away from provocation, accept help, listen to a child. And those scenes are framed with as much intensity as the fights, because for Paul, vulnerability is scarier than any opponent. The film also has a subtle critique of spectacle. Early on, the ring is shown as bright, loud, almost sacred. But later, the idea of people watching becomes sinister. Who is watching Ririn? Who is tracking them? Who benefits from Paul's downfall? It turns the crowd from an abstract celebration into a symbol of how public attention can devour you. Even the poisoning plot element feels like a commentary on corruption in competitive worlds, how success attracts sabotage, how purity in sports is often more myth than reality. Without spoiling specifics, the film does explore the aftermath of that poisoning in ways that complicate your sense of justice. It's not as simple as, find the person and punch them. The story suggests that blame is spread across a network, across incentives, across people who profit from chaos. That, again, makes the film feel grounded. Let's talk about how the movie handles emotion, because this is where Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer either wins you or loses you. It's not a tearjerker in the obvious sense, it's more like a slow leak. You might not cry in the big moments. You might find your throat tightening in the small ones, when Paul hears a child's footsteps and freezes, when he sits outside a door and can't bring himself to knock, when Vinny looks at Paul with a mixture of gratitude and fear because she doesn't know if the man protecting them is stable enough to be near her child. The film is filled with these micro-expressions of trauma. And what makes it especially effective is that it doesn't offer easy catharsis. The dead don't come back. The past doesn't get erased. Paul's pain isn't solved by heroism. Even when he does something good, it doesn't automatically make him feel good. That's a hard truth many films avoid, because audiences like reward systems. Do good, feel redeemed. Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer suggests redemption might be something you practice, not something you receive. The pacing, as I hinted earlier, is deliberate. Some viewers will call it slow in the middle, especially if they expected constant action. But I think the film is intentionally building dread and attachment. It wants you to care about the daily survival details so that when danger hits, it doesn't feel like a set piece, it feels like a violation. The movie also does a good job at varying tension. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's the anxiety of waiting for a phone to ring, of seeing the same motorbike behind you twice, of noticing a stranger lingering too long. That kind of tension is more sustainable than non-stop fights, and it matches the story's reality. Criminals don't always attack when you're ready. Sometimes they stalk, they pressure, they isolate. And Paul, having been poisoned before, is especially sensitive to unseen threats, which makes him paranoid in a way that's both useful and tragic. He's right to be afraid, and yet fear is also eating him alive. In terms of cinematography and editing, the film's action sequences are cut with clarity. You can see what's happening, which is a lost art these days. Hits have consequences, bodies react realistically, fatigue accumulates. And when Paul gets hurt, the film doesn't treat it like a temporary inconvenience. It lingers on bruises, on limps, on the way pain changes decisions. That realism makes the stakes feel higher. It also reinforces the idea that Paul's body is not infinite. He can't just fight forever. Which makes his choice to protect Ririn more meaningful. He's spending his remaining physical currency on someone else. I also want to point out how the movie uses the courier job as a storytelling device. Deliveries become opportunities to show different slices of the city, different economic layers, different faces of indifference and kindness. And it gives the film a kind of urban odyssey structure, where Paul is constantly moving, constantly encountering reminders of what he lost and what he might still save. Sometimes a delivery puts him near a gym where he hears the sound of training and you can see his jaw tighten. Sometimes it puts him near families, children, laughter, and the camera lingers just long enough for you to feel how alien that happiness is to him now. The film doesn't overstate these moments, it trusts you to connect them. Now, audience reaction and cultural impact. Obviously, since this is a 2026 release in our scenario, we're talking about a movie that feels built to travel through word of mouth. It's the kind of film people recommend not by saying, the fights are cool, but by saying, I didn't expect it to hit me like that. It has the ingredients for a broad reach. Action fans get real choreography, drama fans get a character-driven tragedy, thriller fans get a hunted child plot with escalating pressure. But what could make it culturally sticky, especially in spaces where kickboxing and combat sports are already part of the pop conversation, is that it reframes the fighter archetype. Instead of worshipping violence as a solution, it treats violence as history that follows you home. It also taps into anxieties that feel contemporary, exploitation of the vulnerable, rare medical conditions becoming targets, the way financial pressure can become a cage, the way reputations can destroy someone faster than any punch. And because it's rooted in a father-daughter tragedy, it becomes a conversation starter about accountability. Viewers tend to split on Paul, and that's a sign the film is doing something interesting. Some people will say, he doesn't deserve forgiveness. Others will say, he deserves a chance to do good. The film doesn't force a single answer, it forces you to sit with the discomfort that both feelings can exist at once. That kind of moral complexity is what keeps a movie alive beyond its runtime. People argue about it. People project their own experiences of loss and guilt and second chances onto it. And if you've ever carried regret, maybe not something as catastrophic as Paul's, but any regret that feels like it changed who you are. This movie finds a way to speak to that without lecturing. Even the villains, while clearly villainous, are not purely theatrical. Ben Turtur's gang operates like a machine, and that's scarier than a charismatic mastermind because machines don't care about your tears. Ryan Yuno's pressure feels like a realistic depiction of how people can be controlled without chains. The film's world feels plausible, and plausibility is what makes fear linger after the credits. Without giving away the ending, I can say the film builds toward a final act that tries to fuse all its identities, sports tragedy, crime thriller, redemption drama, into one emotional crescendo. And the smartest choice it makes is that it doesn't treat the climax as a boss fight. It treats it as a test of whether Paul can be a different kind of man under the worst stress. The question isn't, can he win? Can he not become the thing he hates about himself? That's far more compelling. There's a moment late in the film where you realize Paul's greatest opponent isn't Ben Turtur or Ryan Yuno or the poisoned fight, it's the reflex inside him that equates force with control. Because the poisoning proved control can be stolen, and his daughter's death proved force can destroy what you love, and yet his entire life has trained him to respond with violence. So the climax, emotionally, is about choice. And that's why the film sticks. It's not just adrenaline, it's character. If I had to sum up what Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer does best, it's that it refuses to make grief decorative. It makes grief functional. Grief drives the plot, shapes the action, poisons the quiet scenes, and even when hope appears through Vinny and Ririn, that hope isn't clean. It's complicated by projection, by fear, by the possibility that Paul's desire to save might be as selfish as it is noble. That complexity is what makes the relationships feel earned. The bond between Paul and Ririn doesn't magically heal him. It challenges him. It provokes him. It forces him to confront the kind of tenderness he avoided because tenderness makes you vulnerable to loss. And Vinny, importantly, isn't just grateful. She's skeptical. She watches Paul, weighing risk, because she's a mother, and mothers in this film are not naive. The film respects that. It respects that trust is not a gift, it's a negotiation. In terms of weaknesses, if you're the kind of viewer who wants tight, fast plotting, you might feel the film indulges in mood a little too long. Some sequences of Paul's courier routine and isolation could be trimmed without losing meaning, depending on your taste. And because the story is juggling multiple antagonistic forces, there are moments where you might wish one threat had more screen time or more personal depth. But honestly, those are minor compared to what the film achieves: an action-driven story that still dares to be sad, a thriller that still dares to be tender, and a character study that still remembers to entertain. And that, to me, is why it's worth your time. Because when the credits roll, you don't just remember who won which fight. You remember a man on a motorbike at night, helmet on, eyes hollow, delivering packages through a city that forgot his name, and you remember the way a child's presence can feel like both salvation and a mirror, and you remember the terrifying idea that redemption isn't a moment where the music swells and everything is forgiven. Redemption is waking up and choosing, again, to be careful with your strength. So my verdict, emotionally, is that Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is the kind of film that sneaks up on you. It sells itself as a kickboxing story, but it's really a story about what happens when your fists are no longer your identity, when the only thing left to fight is the part of you that believes you're unworthy of love. If you watch it for action, you'll get real, grounded, bruising choreography. If you watch it for suspense, you'll get a tightly wound threat built around Ririn's rare blood type and the predatory logic of Ben Turtur's gang and Ryan Yuno's pressure. But if you watch it for something deeper, you'll find a surprisingly intimate portrait of a father who can't undo the worst second of his life, trying to spend the rest of his life making sure another child gets to keep hers. And when a movie can make you feel that kind of ache while still keeping you on the edge of your seat, that's not just a good genre film, that's a story that earns its bruises. There are films that make your heart race because of the action, and there are films that make it ache because of the truth they carry. And then, once in a while, a film comes along that does both with such precision that you find yourself leaning forward not just to see who lands the next punch, but to hear what your own conscience has to say in the silence between the impacts. And Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is exactly that kind of film, a bruising, breath-held, emotionally fraught journey that opens on the sheen of a ring under merciless lights and somehow ends up interrogating grief, guilt, and the fragile ways a man tries to crawl back into the light after the worst night of his life, where the loudest sound isn't the bell but the weight of what one split second can take away. And as we drop into the world of Paul Hucken, the former undefeated champion whose fists built a legend and whose one mistake shatters everything, we're not just watching an action drama from 2026, we're witnessing an anatomy of a fall and the faint, flickering anatomy of a rise, and it's a ride you should be ready for, because it's not kind, and it's not easy, and it's not content to merely entertain, it wants to open you up. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because this is a conversation worth having and I want to know where you're watching from when a film like this hits you the way it hit me. And as we step further into this, let's ground ourselves in the simple facts of what Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is trying to achieve at the moment it arrives in 2026, coming out of a film culture that has never shied away from bringing grit and kinetic storytelling to the screen, but this piece does something else entirely. It marries the muscular poetry of combat with the intimacy of a father's ruined heartbeat, presenting a story that begins with an undefeated record, a crowd chanting a name they think they know, and a body that's been betrayed before the first bell rings. And the brilliance of the opening is not that it's just a thrilling match, although it is absolutely that, it's that you can feel something is wrong long before Paul does. You can feel a heaviness in his arms that isn't nerves, a fuzz in his vision that isn't camera shake, a slow drip dread that leaks into your own chest as he tries to plant his feet and throw a jab that looks like it's moving through syrup, and the film never shouts that he's been poisoned. It lets you understand through the way his breath shortens and his corners look at each other with a fear they don't dare voice, his coach dabbing a towel at his face like cotton can wipe away a chemical ache, and in between rounds you notice the water bottle, the tiniest half-second cut, just enough to lurch your gut and make you wonder if someone isn't playing fair. But then the bell goes and there's no time to be a detective, there's only time to watch a champion die by inches, not because someone's better than him, but because someone is willing to do worse, and in that sickening slow motion of a man's aura dimming under the lights, the film dares to ask what it means to lose dishonorably when your life has been built on the integrity of the fight. But it doesn't linger there, because the fight is not this story's center, it's the trapdoor. And as Paul stumbles out of the ring, as what's left of him clings to ropes that feel like thin threads keeping him tethered to his old life, we find the scene that reorients the entire film, the moment that every beat of the next 2 hours plus will echo, the corridor, the fluorescent hum of a backstage labyrinth, the sudden eruption of a confrontation with his opponent, a shove, a sweep of a forearm, a misstep, the brittle sound of something metal colliding with the wall, and then the impossible, the unimaginable, the backwash of physics and rage and confusion turning into a terrible accident, his daughter in the wrong place at the wrong moment, the impact that the camera barely shows because it knows the worst violence happens in your imagination, the silence that follows as if the entire building has held its breath, and all the sound cuts out so that the only thing that remains is Paul's face, his mouth trying to form her name, and the sky inside him falling apart, and in that instant, whatever the film promised you in the ring is gone, and what's left is a man swallowed by the unforgivable. And there's a courage in that storytelling choice, because now you aren't watching a comeback story in the conventional sense, you're watching a study in shame, in self-punishment, in how a community can turn a man into an outcast not because he swung but because he didn't catch what the world dropped at his feet fast enough to stop it from breaking. And this is where the texture of 2026 comes in, not in some flashy futurism, but in the way the world moves on without you and the way bureaucracy and rumor can strangle you more than any chokehold in the ring ever could, as Paul is separated from his family not by courts in a way the film diagrammatically lays out, but by the cold banishment of grief. His partner's eyes no longer a place where he can rest and the faces of those he once called friends closing like doors, and the film takes its time in this purgatory, letting us watch him slide into the anonymous economy of a city's underbelly, working as a courier, a runner for packages that need to move quickly and discreetly and not always delicately, weaving through alleys and neon-wet streets on a motorbike that sounds like a mosquito under street lamps, the camera mounted so close that you can see the tremor in his wrist as he throttles to outrun the memories that sit on the back of his seat like a second rider. And in this routine, in the repetition of pick-up and drop-off, we start to feel how someone can be both hypervisible, a body in constant motion, and completely invisible, just another helmet in the swarm. And then comes the turn, the small hinge that will open the film into a different space. Through one of his deliveries he intersects with Vinnie Jenner, The kind of man who looks like he's spent his life trying to keep his head above a debt-rimmed ocean, eyes that dart when the word favor pops into a conversation, shoulders that slump because he's been carrying a secret for too long, and around him flits the bright, stubborn presence of his daughter, Ririn, 8 years old, with that unrepeatable mix of reckless curiosity and phantom sadness that some children have when they understand more than they should and say less than they know. And it's not just that she's the same age as Paul's daughter was, though the film knows what it's doing when it places them together in frame. It's that in the careful way she watches him, measuring the space between herself and this battered stranger, we see how the story is going to open a crooked door for Paul, offering a glimmer of purpose that is both salvation and temptation, because the worst thing he can do is try to replace what he lost, and the best thing he can do is learn how to protect without pretending he is owed a second chance for free. And into this delicate space of possibility stomps danger, wearing two faces, one blunt and street-streaked, one cold and clean. Ben Turtur's gang, collective that the film doesn't glamorize but also doesn't caricature, men with knives and reasons, money and hunger, and further up the chain or perhaps merely on a parallel ladder, an operator named Ryan, the kind who looks like he never spills soup on his tie because he has people to bring him the bowl, who pressures Vinny with a mix of soft threats and hard deadlines, making it clear that Vinny's mistakes have consequences, and that those consequences will land on Ririn if he doesn't deliver on an ugly deal, and the film takes the time to explain why Ririn is a target without falling into exposition dumps, threading the detail of her blood type into scenes of clinics and whispered bargains, the looming specter of Reese's negative scarcity turning a little girl into a resource. And that's one of the uglier truths the film wants us to sit with. Bodies become exchangeable commodities when desperation is in the room. And when a child's rare blood turns her into a checklist item on someone's ledger, your stomach drops, because the stakes are no longer abstract, they are painfully literal, pints and donors and schedules measured in hours not months. And when Paul realizes this, when he sees that the fragile hope he felt in the presence of Ririn also puts a target on her back, something in him reconfigures, not into the arrogant electricity of the fighter who won every bout, but into the stubborn gravity of a man who refuses to let another child be taken under his watch, even if the city itself rises up to push against him. And what the film executes so beautifully is the way it binds those decisions to visual choices, to the way the camera hugs him when he's alone and almost recoils when he's forced into contact, the way streetlights become interrogation lamps and doorways look like cage bars. And in those moments what you feel is not just the pulse of a thriller, but the ache of a moral choice ricocheting through a life that's already shattered. And that's where Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer earns its title, because this isn't a fight movie, it's a movie about the rhythms and ruptures of a fighter's life after the ring has been turned into a grave, the way he learns to breathe again when the only breaths that seem to matter anymore were the ones he can't get back. And as a reviewer who lives for this collision of physical storytelling and moral weight, I have to say this film, released in 2026 into a world that's still trying to find its way back from its own stumbles, hit like an unexpected uppercut. And not because it was loud, but because it was deliberate, because it made you earn every catharsis, and every moment you thought you wanted a violent release the film made you ask whether that release would be for anyone other than yourself. And that's what separates this from so many genre pieces. It doesn't move toward violence as the destination. It treats it as an obstacle on the way to clarity, and that's hard to pull off, but it does it again and again, like in the scene where Paul, now deep into his courier roots, sees a grey sedan idling by the curb outside a clinic where Vinny has taken Ririn for a test, and the way he watches the second hand of the clock in the waiting room stutter forward tells you he learned to count time in rounds. Every 3 minutes the difference between standing and falling, and when the wrong kind of coincidence happens, the hallway suddenly too crowded with men who don't look like they are waiting for results. This is where the film's composure shines. It doesn't explode, it seethes, letting a chase slip out of the doors like smoke and spill across the city's surfaces, wet, reflective, hostile, with Paul on the motorbike that's been his only constant, weaving and slipping as rain needled into the scene turns every corner into a coin flip, and the choreography of it is compact and muscular. Nothing wasted, not a single flourish that doesn't also advance character, because even in the adrenaline you clock the careful way Paul reaches for Ririn to keep her behind his shoulder, the way he tilts his head away to take the spray, the way he uses his own body to make a wall where there is none, and as he peels through, the film cuts us back to the past, to a ring where he didn't protect fast enough, not as a scold, but as a painful explanation for why he'll break traffic laws and his own Bones now, because sometimes the only thing that can answer grief is a promise that supersedes every other instinct, and when they shake the tail for a brief moment and duck into a makeshift hideout, a half-closed mechanic's shop with shuttered doors and the smell of oil that clings to everything, you get a quiet that is volcanic, a moment where Ririn asks one small question that hits like a blow, something like, "Are you a bad man?" And the way the lead actor plays this answer is why. Performance matters in a film like this. He doesn't say the right line, he doesn't give her a neat absolution, he says something like, "I was, and I am trying to be less so," and it's that mixture of confession and aspiration that turns a sequence into an arc, because you understand that he is not promising victory, he is promising effort, and that is more honest than the genre often allows, and from there the story swells into a knot of dilemmas. Vinny's debts coming due under the heavy shadow of Ryan Yuno's pressure, revealing a side to Vinny that complicates our easy sympathy, because the film isn't naive, it knows that fathers make bargains they think are for the good of their children, and sometimes those bargains are exactly what the villains want, and so when Vinny wavers, the audience wavers with him, understanding the drag of the hook even as we scream internally for him to cut the line, and Paul's instinct to judge is strangled by his memory of how quick a life can be undone, making him more patient than he might have been, more willing to talk than strike. And those scenes, the quiet negotiations in cramped rooms with single bulbs where every sentence is a kind of feint, fulfill a different kind of action, the action of restraint, of thinking, of trying to solve a puzzle without flipping the table, and yet, inevitably, the violence finds them again, because sometimes the world only speaks in one language when money is involved, and so we get the fight scenes, yes. And they are terrific, not in their size, but in their specificity. The kind of blunt choreography that knows a low kick in a narrow hallway doesn't look like a spinning showcase, it looks like a knee making an ugly dent, a head bouncing off a wall with a sound that stays rang in your ears, and of all those scenes there is one in a warehouse, a musty labyrinth of crates and shadow where Ben Turtur's crew thinks they can bottle Paul up like a trapped fly. That stands out for how the camera refuses to be impressed by the surface and instead works to make you feel the breath inside each exchange. How the echoing space turns every movement into a flare that draws attention, how Paul uses what the ring taught him but also how he unlearns it, forgetting about performance and thinking only about survival, slipping between bodies and boxes, leveraging every bit of cover, and when he takes a beat, sliding behind a stack, catching the faint wheeze that means he's not as young as he used to be. You feel the truth of it and the force of it, that a fight is a conversation with your own limits. And the film turns that into both sport and confession, and with each encounter, there's a layering of responsibility, because Ririn watches, and the film is acutely aware of the ethics of the gaze, so it frames her in reflections, in partial views, protecting her from full exposure even as it acknowledges that the violence is shaping her. And that is the sorrow of it, because the movie knows that to protect her he may have to make her witness, and that contradiction is the bleeding heart of the story. And here's where we talk about the cinematic texture more deliberately, the way the director, whose name the film doesn't brandish like a flag but whose hand you can feel in the control of tone, stitches image and sound to generate a world, the palette slung between sodium yellow streets and sterile clinic whites, the sound design toggling between the percussive thump of a heavy bag and the near silence of corridors. Only the squeak of sneakers or a zipper's scrape telling you life is still humming beneath the dread, and the score, spare and propulsive when it wants you to move, quiet and almost fragile when it wants you to sit in a feeling, a kind of heartbeat motif that crops up in unexpected places, tying together the ring, the chase, and the quiet, like a compositional reminder that all of this is the same trembling life trying to find its rhythm. And when the film breathes, it breathes in long takes that ask you to look, not blink away, not reach for a joke to diffuse what isn't funny, and it's bold enough to let the faces of its actors carry the weight, to let a glance be a paragraph, to leverage silence as a kind of speech, and that restraint pays dividends, because when it does cut, when it does push into a staccato rhythm for a fight, you feel the urgency not as adrenaline but as panic, the way real fear moves, scrambling, desperate, purposeful but not polished, and that's what makes the action sequences feel like extensions of character rather than interludes bolted on for spectacle, and the editing in those sequences is intelligent, always respecting geography, so you never feel cheated about where someone is in relation to someone else, maintaining clarity so that your emotional confusion doesn't get compounded by visual confusion. And in terms of performance, the lead actor's work as Paul is just anchored in bone. You can see the physical credibility in how he moves, but also the emotional credibility in how he avoids playing pity or pitying himself, And that is huge, because a lesser performance would beg for forgiveness, whereas here we get a man who believes he may never deserve it and chooses to act regardless, and in that choice, the film finds its core, and the actress who plays Ririn is luminous without ever being precocious. The kind of child performance where you forget she's acting because the film never puts adult lines in her mouth, instead giving her small, precise things to do that speak volumes, a gesture with a scrunchie, a way of holding her breath when someone raises their voice, the patience with which she watches a kettle boil, suggesting a child who has learned that boiling points matter. And Vinny, oh Vinny, the film wisely refuses to make him a monster or a saint, and the actor finds the shame in a man who knows what the right thing is but has trained his muscles to respond to the wrong thing out of habit. And watching him try to rewire himself under pressure gives the story a texture of real time. You sense that if he can hold on one more day, he might make the right call, and if he can't, the consequences will ripple into years. And then you have Ben Turter and Ryan Yuno, who occupy two poles of villainy, one raw, one refined, the heavy and the handler, the street enforcer whose gaudy brutality masks his own fear of irrelevance, and the urbane fixer whose calm voice covers up the enormity of what he's facilitating. And their scenes do not devolve into cartoon. Instead, the film shows us why they do what they do, not to exonerate them but to explain them, because explanation is a tool of drama, not a weapon against accountability, and that nuance is part of what makes the film stay with you. You find yourself thinking about how systems run on shared fictions, and when those fictions are about blood and who deserves to live, the results are far more chilling than any blade. And speaking of blood, it's impossible not to talk about the motif that runs through the film from dialogue to imagery, the way blood type becomes a key not just to hospitals but to belonging, to community, to who owes what to whom, and the rhesus negative detail is employed with sensitivity, not as a gimmick, but as a plot reality that opens out into bigger questions, like how scarcity makes predators bold and makes parents feel their options evaporate. And all of this is nested inside a pacing that takes its time, yes, but never meanders. There's a confidence in how the film spends its long middle, letting us live with these people so that when the narrowing happens, when events accelerate into the final act, we aren't thinking in terms of plot points, we're thinking in terms of consequences for people we now know. And that is the difference between watching a movie and living in it for a while. And in that final act, which I will not spoil in its specifics because it deserves to trap you in its own logic as it trapped me, there is an escalation that feels inevitable, a collision between what Paul owes the world and what he owes himself, between what Vinny thinks he has to do and what he finally realizes he cannot do, between the crude enforcement of Ben Turter's gang and the polished coercion represented by Ryan Yuno, and the film lays all the choices on the table without leaning on coincidence, instead relying on the slower machinery of cause and effect, and by the time we reach the crescendo, you realize that the film has been quietly building not toward a victory but toward a confession, and even if there is a fight, and oh yes, there is one that matters, it's almost a ritual, a way of asking for permission to change, and it's unforgettable not because of how hard the hits land, though they do, but because of who is watching and why. And when afterward you sit in the dark waiting for your breath to even out, you realize that the brilliance of Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer lies not just in its composition of these set pieces, but in its attentiveness to moral weather, to the gusts of shame and love that blow us into acts we barely recognize in ourselves. And in terms of background, it's a 2026 film that walks into a marketplace crowded with noise and chooses to be quiet until it absolutely has to raise its voice, a production that seems to have made choices carefully rather than loudly, from casting to location to the decision to hold the camera so close to the human faces that you sometimes forget you're in an action narrative. And that, I think, is part of why audiences who have found it are talking about it with that particular glow that comes when you're grateful something took you seriously as a viewer. And this is the part where we think about reception and cultural impact not in terms of numbers but in terms of conversations, because what this film touches, beyond the thriller mechanics, are nerves in the body politic, questions about the value of a life in economies that would measure it, about the responsibilities we bear when our skills are violence adjacent, about the social reflex to punish rather than to repair. And as that discourse trickles across comments, living rooms, and maybe even the hushed lobbies of places where people still share air after movies, you can sense the weight of a story that refused to make it easy. And yes, some will quibble with the pacing, because patience is a braver ask than ever in a moment where everything is an algorithm telling you to move on in 15 seconds, but those who surrender to the rhythm will find the rewards compound, the footnotes of early scenes paying off in ways that feel both inevitable and surprising, and the casting, beyond the main quartet, nails the supporting texture. The gym rats who look at Paul the way exiles look at their old house from across the street, the clinic receptionist whose compassion becomes a tiny light in a dark day, the landlord who wants to be kind but also needs rent, the neighbor who locks his door not out of malice but out of fear, and those little human choices accumulate into a world that feels lived in, not a constructed obstacle course for our heroes and villains. And in terms of craft, the film's use of light is smart, often letting the city paint the characters in sodium and neon while reserving pure whites for spaces where choices will be made that redraw the map. A formal metaphor for moral clarity arriving in rooms nobody wants to be in, and the use of rain is not merely atmospheric, it's tactile, a way of forcing everyone to move slower, take shorter steps, examine their footing, which is exactly what the story demands of them. And while we're being honest, yes, there are a couple of beats that telegraph themselves if you've seen 1,000 thrillers, but they do so in the service of something richer, a shared language between the film and the audience that allows it to bend into deeper shapes, like a dancer repeating a familiar move so you can appreciate how it's being twisted toward a new expression. And there's a particular sequence late in the film in a hospital corridor, all white walls and humming machines, where a threat doesn't come from a gun but from a clipboard, a form, a gatekeeping rule that forbids a donor to know too much, and the way the film stages that confrontation, using stillness and a barely contained pleading in Paul's voice, is more harrowing than if someone had swung a machete, because it shows you another face of the violence we live with, paperwork as a guillotine. And that's bold storytelling, the admission that not all fights can be won with fists, not all villains can be knocked out, and still, somehow, we have to live. And that insistence on holding contradiction in the frame is why the film feels full even when it refuses to give you what you think you want. It respects you too much to hand you sugar. And that's also why the final beats hit the way they do, because whatever happens to Ben Turter, whatever mask Ryan wears when he realizes that control is an illusion we sell to ourselves when we don't want to face the randomness that governs our lives, the film refuses to tell you that justice is tidy, that the scales balance cleanly. Instead it tells you that humans keep trying anyway, and that sometimes the trying is the justice. And when the credits roll, if you're like me, you won't jump up, you'll sit. You'll rewind the scenes of Paul walking, helmet in hand, past the sleeping market. You'll hear the faint echo of pads being hit in an empty gym. You'll see the accidental weight of a hand on a child's shoulder that somehow becomes heavier with love as the film goes on, until by the end that same hand is light because it understands finally that protecting someone also means letting them walk ahead sometimes. And if we talk about themes distilled, we get to this: redemption isn't a place you arrive at, it's a practice, a thing you do over and over until your bones remember even when your brain forgets. And the film's genius is making that tangible in a body that has delivered blows and taken them and now needs to learn to reach for water bottles and food and small kindnesses instead. And we can zoom in further on how the film interrogates masculinity, not with a sermon, but with a portrayal of silence, of withheld tears, of stubbornness that is both a shield and a curse. And then we can zoom out to how the film frames community response, the way gossip gut punches a man already down, the way it takes an act of bravery for a neighbor to say hello again, the way shame isolates and how contact can be an antidote. And the film's willingness to have side characters live with their choices, even minor ones, means that by the end you feel like a small city has lived and shifted on screen. And it's not hyperbole to say that the chemistry among the leads is the engine, the electricity that flows between Paul and Ririn calibrated so carefully that it never slides into creepy fabulousness or overcompensation. It stays right in that uncomfortable place where affection grows and guilt battles with gratitude. And Vinny's arc, which could have been a footnote, instead takes center stage in moments because his choices are the junction where the plot's rails meet. And we watch him falter and we want to shake him, but the film loves him enough to show us that changing direction while running at full speed is hard, and that mercy often looks like giving someone one more chance than we think they deserve. And Ben Turter, in his cartoonish jacket that the film somehow renders human by the way it hangs on him like borrowed armor, has a moment that you almost wish you didn't see. A brief flash of tenderness toward a stray dog that confuses you until you remember humans are all contradictions stacked on contradictions, and it doesn't absolve him of a thing, but it complicates your thirst for simple retribution, which the film absolutely uses to test you, like the mismatch in a ring that you still have to fight through to prove you can keep your hands up even when you're not being challenged. And Ryan last exchange with Paul is one of those scenes you'll quote not for its lines but for its energy. The sense that two men who cannot understand each other are briefly occupying the same moral forced perspective, and then, inevitably, they separate. because one functions in a world where risk is burned off into other people's lives and one no longer wants to burn anything. And if I can step back for a second to talk about the technical craft, because I don't want to undersell it while praising the heart. The fight choreography is stripped of vanity in a way that deserves applause. It's built from the ground up on economy and tactical thinking, which is what you expect from a kickboxer trained to spend energy like money, carefully, sparingly, striking where it counts, and the edits honor that, full body shots when necessary, and there's a sense of weight, impacts that don't feel like CGI gloss but like real hits translated into cinematic language, and the sound design sells it without overplaying it, each bone thud and fabric scrape carefully mixed so it's clean but not sterile, and between the fights, the camera favors faces, hands, small gestures, and some might find that indulgent, but when a film cares this much about interior lives, it's a gift, a way of keeping the audience in the same emotional register as the characters. And I have to mention one very small scene that stuck with me. Paul, at a food stall late at night, counting coins, buying a bowl of soup, sitting and watching steam curl like ghosts, and the camera rests on his hands as he warms them over the bowl, and you can feel the distance between him and the past, not just in time but in temperature, the cold he has been living in and the heat that he's letting in molecule by molecule, and that is cinema, making poetry out of a hand over soup. And speaking of poetry, the film's script shows a discipline with dialogue, no quips, no monologues that feel like they exist to be clipped and shared. It's all in service of the moment, lines that probably don't look like much on the page but feel like everything in the air, and that's good writing, understanding that not all brilliance announces itself, and if we talk about the broader cultural currents, it's impossible not to notice how the film takes on medical scarcity without turning into a treatise, how it acknowledges a black market ecosystem without fetishizing it, how it uses the Rh-negative detail not as exotic flavor but as a way to reflect on how vulnerability can be mapped onto the body in ways society will exploit if we let it, and in that, there's a quiet activism to the film, saying we should be better by showing us what happens when we are not, and the audience reaction, from the people I talk to and the comments I've seen popping up around conversation spaces where folks stretch beyond the algorithm's immediate reach, has been deeply engaged, with some calling it a new high water mark for action-drama hybrids that respect grief, and others debating whether the film should have pushed harder on consequences for certain characters, which is a healthy debate because it means the film did not anesthetize the moral dilemma, it left the nerve exposed, and that's what good art should do, make us argue not about what color the explosions were but about what we owe each other when the worst has happened. And as we edge toward the end of this reflection, I want to circle back to where we started, that ring under lights, and ask you to think about how the film reframes victory, because by the time you get to the end, the idea of winning has been stripped down to something raw, quiet, and deeply personal. Maybe it's a handshake in a hallway, maybe it's a note slipped under a door, maybe it's just a breath taken without sobbing, and that is the magic of this experience. It reminds you that most of the fights worth fighting are ones where nobody claps at the end, and so Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is both the story of a man and a diagnosis of a moment, and while some will watch it to enjoy expertly staged brawls and cascading chases and will not be disappointed, the ones who let the film pull them into the deeper water will find something close to a ritual of mourning and a blueprint for trying again. And as for a verdict, as for whether I think you should give your time to this piece, the answer is an unhesitating yes, with the caveat that you should go in ready to feel, ready to sit with scenes that do not give you out-loud answers, ready to let go of the protective jokes we use to skate across the surface of pain, because the film deserves that, and because if you meet it on its own terms, it will reward you with something rare, an action film that understands that every hit is a sentence in a longer story about how we find our way back to each other. That the Real title hovering behind the official one could have been something like the life of a man learning to live again, and in that sense the film stays with you, not in the way a spectacular explosion lingers as a GIF in your mind, but in the way a difficult conversation reverberates for days, and as that reverberation quiets, it resolves into something like a promise, that it is possible to begin again even when you cannot go back, that you can hold in your hands both the memory of a daughter who will never grow up and the presence of a child who needs you now, without pretending one replaces the other, that you can stand up without pretending the ground didn't shake under you, and that is where I want to leave you, in the company of a film that had the courage to take a genre built on forward momentum and ask it to pause, to look back, to apologize, and then, when it was ready, to move forward again with intention rather than frenzy. And so when You watch Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer, watch for the fights, watch for the chases, yes, but also watch for the quiet hand on a shoulder, the eyes that don't flinch, the soup that warms a hand, the rain that slows a city, and the breath taken just before a man decides to be better than the worst thing he's ever done, because that is where the movie truly lives. And that is why it deserves a place in the conversations we have about what this form can do when it refuses to settle for surface, and in the end, when the credits have rolled and the room is light again, you might find yourself standing a little slower, hearing the ghosts and the new voices in your own life make room for each other. And if that happens, know that it's because the film did what it set out to do. It cut deeper than the flesh, it landed its blows on the parts of us that need shaking, and it asked us not to forget the question that matters most, not who is the strongest, but who will protect the small. And in this year, in this time, that question is not only cinematic, it is urgent, and this film, fierce and humane, looks you in the eye and says, softly but firmly, answer. And what really makes the movie linger is how it keeps circling back to the idea that a fighter's instincts don't shut off when the bell stops ringing, they just leak into places they don't belong, and the script is constantly finding new ways to show you that Paul Hucken's greatest skill, his readiness to react, has become the very thing that endangers him, because in the early champion days, reaction time meant survival and dominance, but in the aftermath of his daughter's death, reaction time becomes this hair-trigger curse, like his body is still trying to solve every problem with the language it was trained in, and that's why some of the most intense scenes in Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer aren't even the fights, they are the almost fights, the moments where someone mouths off in a cramped corridor, or a stranger steps too close to rear in at a street stall, and you can literally see Paul's shoulders tighten and his weight shift and his jaw set, and the movie holds the shot long enough for you to feel the terrifying question, is he about to protect, or is he about to repeat history? Because trauma doesn't just make you sad, it makes you fast, it makes you vigilant, it makes you interpret the world like it's always 1 second away from disaster, and Paul has earned that paranoia twice over, first with the poisoning, the ultimate proof that danger can enter you without your consent, and then with that accidental family catastrophe, proof that danger can also come from you when you're not careful with your own strength. The film's writing is very deliberate about the details that connect Ririn to Paul's lost daughter, and it could have been cheap, it could have been an obvious emotional hack, but it actually plays like a psychological trap that Paul is trying to step around while also falling into it, because it's not only the age and blood type, it's the way Ririn sometimes echoes small behaviors, how she frowns when she concentrates, how she tries to act older than she is when adults are panicking, how she chooses silence as a kind of control, and the movie uses those echoes sparingly so they hit harder when they happen. There's one scene where Ririn is sitting on the floor doing something child simple, like arranging little objects into a pattern, and Paul watches her like he's watching an alternate timeline, and for a split second you can see his face soften into something like relief, and then it curdles into panic because relief feels like betrayal, and that's the emotional logic the film understands. If you loved someone who died, any new love can feel like you're replacing them, and even when that's not true, the guilt tells you it is. Vinny, meanwhile, becomes the anchor that keeps the film from turning into pure male angst, because Vinny is not mesmerized by Paul's legend, she's not impressed by his past, and she's not interested in the mythology of the undefeated champion, because her reality has never had the luxury of myth. Her reality is rent, threats, men who think pressure is romance, criminals who see a child as inventory, and a constant need to make decisions without enough information, and that's why her dynamic with Paul is so compelling. She needs him, but she doesn't trust him, and she respects his capability while fearing his volatility, and you can tell the film has been written by someone who understands that trust isn't an on-off switch, it's a dimmer, it brightens and darkens based on what people do in the small moments. So when Paul helps, Vinny doesn't immediately melt, she watches, she tests, she asks questions that make him uncomfortable, and those questions matter because they expose the gap between being a great fighter and being a safe person, and Paul has to confront that gap in a way he never did when he was winning belts. The movie also uses the courier work as a recurring metaphor in a way that quietly gets more devastating the longer it goes on, because a courier is paid to carry what isn't his, to deliver what belongs to someone else, and Paul is carrying grief that isn't deliverable. He's carrying shame that can't be handed off, and he's trying to deliver safety to a child when he couldn't deliver it to his own, and every time he returns to the job, it feels like he's punishing himself with normalcy, like he's trying to bury his past under repetitive routes and cheap pay, but the city keeps reminding him that he's still the man who fell on live television, the the man who had a public defeat with an invisible cause, the man people whisper about, and the film doesn't let you forget how cruel a community can be when it decides your story is finished. There's a recurring motif of people recognizing him and then looking away, and it's shot in this painfully realistic way where the camera doesn't dramatize it with zoom-ins or melodramatic music, it just lets you sit in the awkwardness of being seen as a cautionary tale, and that's where the movie's cultural sting lies, because for a lot of former icons, whether in sports, entertainment, or just in local communities, the fall isn't only financial, it's social. The world doesn't only take your money, it takes your right to be ordinary. And Paul is desperate to be ordinary because ordinary means harmless, but the world won't grant him that anonymity. And then you've got Ben Turtur's gang, which the film depicts less like a band of colorful villains and more like an ecosystem, the kind that thrives on vulnerability. And what I liked is how the gang's pursuit of Ririn doesn't feel like a single-minded cartoon plot, it feels like a marketplace, like there are phone calls and intermediaries and constant recalculations, and that's what makes it horrifying. Because it suggests there's nothing personal about what they want from her, it's business. And business is harder to negotiate with than anger. Anger can cool down, business only wants profit. Ben Turtur himself is framed as the face of that system, confident, patient, violent when necessary, but the film doesn't waste time making him an overwritten mastermind with monologues. He's scary because he's practical, because he doesn't need to hate you to hurt you, and in a story about redemption, a practical villain is the worst kind because you can't appeal to his emotions, you can only outmaneuver him, and Paul, for all his ring IQ, is learning that street danger doesn't come with gloves and referees, it comes with corners and numbers and leverage. Ryan is a different flavor of poison, and that's one of the film's smartest parallel choices. Paul was literally poisoned to lose control of his body, and Vinny is being metaphorically poisoned by Ryan's pressure. By the way coercion seeps into her decision-making, the way it narrows her options until she starts thinking in terms of survival instead of dignity, and the film shows how coercion can be disguised as care, how it can wear a smile, how it can say, "I'm helping you," while tightening a noose, and it's the kind of depiction that's uncomfortable because it's familiar to a lot of people, especially women who've had to navigate men who believe persistence is entitlement. So as Paul tries to defend Vinny and Ririn, he's not just fighting fists, he's fighting influence, he's fighting a web of obligations and threats that existed before he showed up, and that complicates his savior position in a way that makes the story feel more honest. You can't just beat up one guy and fix someone's life. Because someone's life is made of systems, debts, fears, and patterns. And because the movie is about kickboxing on the surface, it uses the body as the central battlefield in a way that keeps expanding. Paul's body as a champion body, then as a poisoned body, then as a guilty body, then as a protective body, then as a body that has to choose restraint, Ririn's body as a child body, then as a hunted body because of a rare blood type, Vinny's body as a mother's body that must stand between threat and child, even when she's exhausted. Even the city's body, the urban landscape, is filmed like something bruised, dented cars, cracked sidewalks, cheap neon reflecting on wet asphalt, everything looking slightly worn down, like the environment itself is a tired fighter. If you pay attention to the camera language, the ring scenes early on are shot with symmetry and clarity, like a world with rules, but the later chase and confrontation scenes are shot with asymmetry, partial obstructions, door frames cutting people in half, reflections in windows, as if the film is saying, this world is fractured, and you don't get full visibility, which ties into the poisoning too. Paul lost because he didn't see what entered his system, and now he's living in a world where danger is always half hidden. And then there's the question the film keeps bringing back, almost like a refrain: what does it mean to deserve safety? Because Paul doesn't believe he deserves it, and that belief is both his punishment and his motivator. There are moments where he actively chooses the more painful option because he thinks pain is what balances the universe, like he's trying to pay a debt that can't be paid. And what's tragic is that this kind of self-punishment isn't noble, it's corrosive. The film shows that clearly when Paul's refusal to accept kindness starts putting Vinny and Ririn at greater risk. He keeps trying to do everything alone, keeps trying to be the wall, and walls crack. That's another theme Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer explores, the myth of the lone protector. The champion narrative trains people to believe in individual strength, but family narratives require shared strength, community strength, the ability to rely on others, and Paul is terrible at that because being a champion taught him to trust only his own hands. There's a scene where someone offers him a simple form of help, nothing heroic, just assistance, information, a safer route, and Paul almost refuses out of pride, out of shame, and out of fear that dependence will make him weak. The film doesn't shame him for this, it shows it as learned behavior, the psychological residue of being celebrated for self-reliance. And that's what makes his slow shift compelling. When he finally starts accepting help, it's not framed like he's becoming soft, it's framed like he's becoming sane. Now on the technical side, because I know a lot of you watching reviews like this want to know whether the action actually delivers. Yes, it does, and what I appreciated most is that the choreography doesn't just show skill, it shows intention. In the ring flashbacks, Paul's strikes are efficient and clean, almost clinical, because he's in his element, he's confident, he's in control. In the street fights, his strikes are often defensive, short, meant to create space rather than to dominate, until he gets triggered, until someone mentions his daughter, or until Ririn screams, and then you see the old Paul flicker in a way that's frightening, because the movie makes violence feel like a door that's easy to reopen once you've lived behind it. There's a particular confrontation, again, keeping it vague, that starts like a simple attempt to intimidate them, and Paul initially tries to de-escalate, which already tells you he's changing, but the other side doesn't respect de-escalation, because in their world, calm is weakness, and when it flips, the choreography becomes messy and close, elbows, clinches, bodies crashing into walls, and you can feel the director's insistence that combat is not pretty, it's survival. And after the fight, the film doesn't do the usual action movie thing where the hero shakes it off. It shows the aftermath, Paul washing blood off his knuckles like he's trying to wash off the past, Vinny shaking as adrenaline fades, Ririn trying to act brave but failing, and those aftermath scenes are where the film earns its emotional credibility. The dialogue is also surprisingly restrained, and in a movie like this, that's a risk, because restraint can be mistaken for emptiness, but here it's purposeful. People in survival mode don't always deliver speeches, they ration words, they hide fear to avoid spreading it, they speak in half-truths because full truth feels too heavy to carry. When Paul does talk about his daughter, it's not a dramatic monologue in perfect phrasing, it's fragmented, reluctant, sometimes almost incoherent, and that's what makes it believable, because grief rarely comes out as poetry, it comes out as broken sentences and long pauses. One of the strongest writing choices is how the film refuses to let Paul's poisoned loss excuse what happened afterward. That would have been the easiest narrative escape. He was drugged, he was out of it, he's not responsible. But the film insists on moral complexity. Yes, he was drugged, yes, he was sabotaged, but the tragedy with his daughter stems from who he was trained to be, from how quickly his instincts went to aggression, from how little space existed between his anger and his actions. And that's what makes his guilt meaningful. If he were purely a victim, redemption would be easy. The film doesn't want easy. It wants true. It wants you to wrestle with the uncomfortable reality that someone can be wronged and still cause wrong, someone can be sabotaged and still be accountable for what they do next. That's a mature perspective for a genre that often prefers clean heroes and clear villains. And speaking of villains, the film also uses them to explore different kinds of power. Ben Turter represents the obvious violent power, the kind that takes by force, while Ryan Yuno represents social power, the kind that takes by pressure, and Paul, ironically, represents bodily power, the kind that can protect but can also destroy. So the story becomes a triangle of power types colliding around a child whose only power is her rarity, which is actually her vulnerability. And that's where the movie's social commentary sharpens. In many societies, the most vulnerable are not targeted despite being weak, they are targeted because something about them is useful to someone else, and that's what makes exploitation so grotesque, it turns human traits into resources. Ririn's rare rhesus negative blood type is the most literal expression of that, and the film treats it with enough specificity to feel grounded without turning into a medical lecture. You're never overwhelmed with jargon, but you understand the stakes, her blood is rare, people want it, and that makes her life a bargaining chip in a world that should never bargain with a child's body. The movie also does something quietly devastating with the idea of replacement. Paul sees Ririn and can't help but feel the echo of his daughter, but Vinny, in her own way, starts to see Paul as a possible replacement too, not for a romantic partner necessarily, but for stability, for protection, for the kind of dependable adult presence that her life has lacked. And the film is honest about how dangerous replacement thinking can be. Because replacements are not real people, they are roles, projections, and roles break when reality doesn't match the fantasy. There are scenes where Vinny's frustration with Paul spikes not because he does something objectively wrong, but because he fails to be the steady pillar she momentarily hoped he could be. And Paul gets frustrated with himself because he realizes he's using Ririn as a redemption project, which is unfair to her. The film doesn't resolve these tensions with a single apology. It lets them simmer, because that's how relationships actually work in crisis. You don't get to have a calm talk with tea and soft music. You argue, you make up, you relapse, you try again, all while danger stays outside the door. As the plot progresses, the sense of being hunted becomes more suffocating, and I love how the film doesn't rely solely on GPS tracking cliches or omniscient villains. Instead, it shows how being poor and on the run is its own trap. You can't just check into a safe hotel. You can't just disappear. Every move costs money, every plan requires contacts, every shelter has risks. Paul's career world actually becomes both asset and liability. He knows routes, he knows corners, he understands timing, but he also has a routine that can be observed, and routines are predictable, and predictability is what predators feed on. There's a great sequence where Paul tries to break his own routine, and the film shows you how hard that is for someone whose entire job is repetition. That's a subtle but effective way to merge character and plot. His livelihood has trained him into patterns, and now those patterns could get a child killed. The mid to late portion of the movie also deepens the poisoning angle in a way that adds emotional resonance without turning into a detective subplot that hijacks the story. You get hints about who benefits from Paul's fall, about how the sports world he left behind might be dirtier than he wanted to believe, and that's important because it expands the film's idea of exploitation beyond street criminals. It suggests a continuum, from promoters who profit from bodies, to gangs who profit from blood, to coercive men who profit from desperation, different arenas, same hunger. And Paul is the connecting thread, a man whose life has been one long negotiation with people who wanted to use him. That's why when he starts protecting Vinny and Ririn, it feels like he's finally choosing a role that isn't about being used, it's about being useful in a way that doesn't destroy him. But the movie never lets you forget the risk. Usefulness can become addiction too, because if Paul starts believing the only way he can earn existence is by saving someone, then what happens when the crisis ends? Does he collapse again? The film plants that question, and it haunts the quieter scenes, the ones where Ririn begins to smile around him, and you can see Paul both relax and panic, because closeness is the prelude to loss, and he has already lost the worst thing imaginable. On a pure emotional level, the movie's strongest weapon is the tension between tenderness and threat. Just when you start to feel safe, like maybe they've found a temporary hiding spot, like maybe Paul can breathe, like maybe Vinny can sleep for an hour, the film introduces a reminder, a knock at the door, a phone buzzing, a shadow outside a window, and you realize safety is temporary in this world, which makes the tender moments feel stolen. There's a scene where Paul teaches Ririn a basic defensive stance, not as a training montage, but as a practical, if someone grabs you, do this, and it's heartbreaking because it's both empowering and tragic that an 8-year-old needs that lesson. Paul tries to make it feel like a game, like a playful thing, but his voice cracks on certain words, and Vinny watches with a complicated expression that says, "Thank you," and also, "This is not the childhood she deserves." That's Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer at its best. It lets the audience feel two things at once, gratitude and sorrow, hope and grief, adrenaline and dread. The film's pacing toward the final act is like tightening a belt. Each scene pulls a little more tension, each decision closes off an option, until you reach a point where it feels like the characters are running out of road. And this is where the movie's thriller mechanics really kick in. Without laying out exact plot beats, the pressure from Ben Turtur's side becomes more direct, more aggressive, less patient, suggesting either desperation or opportunity. Ryan Yuno's pressure on Vinny escalates in a way that feels like a turning screw, and it forces Vinny into choices that make the audience uneasy because you understand why she does them even if you don't like them. And Paul, caught between his protective impulse and his self-disgust, is forced to decide what kind of man he's going to be when the only options left are ugly. That's the key word, ugly. This film doesn't promise clean solutions. It promises consequences. The action climax, when it comes, works because it's not designed as fan service, it's designed as emotional payoff. Every hit feels like it's about something more than domination. Every time Paul gets the upper hand, you don't cheer in a simple way, because you're also afraid of what winning does to him psychologically. There's a moment, again, being careful, that feels like the movie is about to let Paul become the old champion again, the unstoppable beast, and you can feel the audience part of you wanting that catharsis, wanting him to unleash and wipe out the villains, because we're conditioned to believe violence can cleanse. And then the film swerves emotionally by reminding you what happened last time Paul let himself unleash outside the ring. So when he chooses restraint, if he chooses it, it lands like real growth, not like a moral lecture, because you understand how much restraint costs a man whose body has been trained for the opposite. And that's what I mean when I say the film's real fight is internal. It's not about whether Paul can win, it's about whether he can stop treating violence like the only door out of suffering. The ending, in terms of emotional resolution, is not the kind of neat bow that tells you everything is fine now. It's closer to a bruise healing, it changes color slowly, it stays tender, and even when it looks better, you remember it was there. The film gives you enough closure to feel satisfied, but not so much that it feels dishonest. It respects the fact that some losses don't get redeemed, they get carried. And it respects the fact that protecting someone else doesn't resurrect the dead. What it can do, though, is change the direction of the living. And that's where the movie leaves you, not with a triumphant, his back on top, but with a quieter, heavier idea that maybe being a good man is not a title you earn once, it's a practice you commit to daily, especially if you've proven to yourself how dangerous you can be. In terms of cultural impact, I can see Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer becoming one of those films that sparks conversations in two totally different audiences. Action fans will debate the choreography, the realism, the brutality, the way the camera lets you see techniques without shaking itself to death, and they'll compare Paul's style in the ring versus the street, and some people will even re-watch just to catch how the film uses stance and footwork to show emotion, how Paul stands squared and confident in flashbacks but angled and guarded in the present. Meanwhile, drama fans will latch onto the moral question, should Paul be allowed to rebuild a life after what happened? And what does allowed even mean when grief doesn't ask permission? And then there's a third audience, maybe the biggest, parents, or anyone who has loved a child, who will watch this film with their heart in their throat, because the movie understands a specific terror that lives in parenthood, the terror of one careless second, one argument, one distraction, and how that can change everything. Even if you've never been in a fight in your life, you'll understand that terror, and that's why the film transcends its genre packaging. It's also why I think the title is deceptively simple. A kickboxer's life, yes, but also, a parent's life, a mother's life, a child's life, a life under pressure, a life after disgrace. And to be honest, what impressed me most is that the movie doesn't try to turn Paul into a saint by the end. It doesn't insist you forgive him. It doesn't demand tears as payment for absolution. Instead, it shows him attempting something harder than a comeback, attempting decency when decency doesn't erase the past. That's a brave narrative choice because it risks leaving some viewers unsatisfied. Some people want the world to be balanced, for guilt to be cleansed through sacrifice, for wrongs to be undone. This film says, sometimes balance is not possible, sometimes the only thing you can do is prevent the next tragedy, and that prevention itself becomes a form of meaning. If I zoom out and look at Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer as a piece of filmmaking, it's a story about bodies cheered, bodies poisoned, bodies blamed, bodies hunted, bodies protected, and it uses the language of combat to talk about something most of us fight in silence, shame. Shame is the opponent Paul can't clinch. Shame is the opponent that doesn't get tired. Shame is the opponent that tells him he's permanently dangerous, permanently unworthy. And the film's most tender moments are when shame loosens its grip for a second, when Ririn falls asleep near him without fear, when Vinny lets her guard down enough to laugh once, when Paul allows himself to imagine a future that isn't only punishment. Those moments are small, but the film frames them like victories, because they are. They are harder than knockouts. They require trust, which is the rarest blood type of all in this story. So if you're asking whether I recommend this movie, it depends on what kind of viewing experience you want. If you want something light, something where the hero's violence is always righteous and the emotions are clean and the ending is a party, this isn't that. This is a bruising, intimate, tense story that uses kickboxing as a skeleton and hangs a complicated human heart on it. But if you want an action drama that respects your intelligence, that treats trauma with seriousness, that delivers real suspense without turning children into props, and that actually interrogates the cost of being a fighter outside the ring, Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is absolutely worth the watch, and it's the kind of film that will have you sitting quietly for a minute after it ends, not because you're confused, but because you're still hearing the echo of that first punch, the one that didn't hit a jaw, the one that hit your chest, reminding you that sometimes the most cinematic battles are fought in the spaces where applause can't reach, and because the film refuses to leave me alone in the days since I first watched it, I find myself circling back to its textures and temperatures, retracing the places where it breathes and the places where it holds its breath, a kind of after-image tour that the best cinema deserves. And Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer is very much that kind of cinema. It lingers not as a single scene or a clean thesis but as a field of small, vibrating choices that add up to a life, and the longer I sit with it, the more I see how intricately it's built to take us through that life without the usual shortcuts, how it withholds indulgence not to be coy but to be honest, and I keep thinking about the spaces in between the obvious beats, the errand runs, the idle minutes at a food stall, the worn laces on gloves knotted and re-knotted and knotted again. The thousand tiny repetitions that turn a fighter's habits into soft rituals that outlast victory and survive defeat, and there's a montage. I call it a montage because it feels like one in memory, though in the film it's rendered as a series of long takes, that follows Paul through a handful of mornings in his new courier routine. The city still yawned open, vendors building their small kingdoms of plastic stools and sizzling pans, and the sound has that lightly damp hush of pre-traffic, a pause before the day's loudness, and into that quiet rides this man who once entered rooms to cheers and now slides past with a helmet reflecting only smears of light, and the camera rides pillion, which is a much smarter position than strapped to the front because it lets the bike become a minor character, a moving half-body that shapes choices, alley or main road, speed up or slow down, and each of these choices carry meaning now because he has a reason for every detour. The places where he used to walk with his daughter are routes he avoids. The cafes where the gym crowd might be sitting are routes he avoids, the boulevard where the stadium sits glaring in daylight is a route he avoids, and the film makes this avoidance visible, not by telling you outright, but by showing you the small flinches that redirect his path, and I can't tell you how much I appreciated that restraint, because in those pivots you see the map of grief overlay the city like a translucent sheet, shaping movement and teaching the body new patterns, and when he finally chooses to turn toward something instead of away from something, the turning matters, it carries the weight of 100 earlier evasions, and that's the way this movie turns plot into life, letting elastic time shrink and stretch to accommodate the size of a single sprained decision. And if we're talking about this sustained attentiveness to the human scale, it makes sense that the film finds so much meaning in hands, the way Paul's hands flutter when he's uncertain, the way he holds a thermos for rearing like it's a delicate artifact, two-handed, careful, the way Vinny's fingers twitch when he's lying, tell that the camera catches twice and then trusts us to remember, the way Ben Turtur's knuckles look like they were chiseled rather than grown, cracked and pale, the way Ryan Uno's nails are immaculate and wave at you like small flags of order even as disorder blooms wherever he walks, and that focus on the tactile turns every exchange into something you can almost physically feel, and it's why the action keeps its bite without behaving like an amusement park ride, because the stakes are not abstract, they are literally who these hands will touch next and in what way. And when Paul uses them to hold back rather than to strike, that becomes a bigger deal than when he throws a beautiful roundhouse, and the film knows it, and it leans into that knowledge over and over, like in a scene mid-film where he's cornered in a narrow staircase and has a clean shot to take someone out and doesn't, opting instead to push, to pin, to restrain, and you can feel the old reflex battling the new marrow-deep decision to govern himself differently, and so when he does let a blow land, it's a choice, not an automatic. And that distinction is like a heartbeat moving under the story's skin, and as an audience member who's watched so many action films kick into autopilot as soon as the fists come out, it felt like a small miracle to see one that kept thinking in the thick of it, that respected the intelligence of the movement rather than just its spectacle. And I can't get away from the sound of his training either, the rhythmic exhale on impact, the leather smack of bag on glove, the low hum you feel in your sternum when someone's hitting a heavy bag in a room that echoes just enough, and those sounds are interlaced with other, quieter sounds the film threads throughout, like the flick of a lighter in the hands of a night guard, the zip of a scooter cover being pulled back, the tick of blinking lights at a crosswalk at 3 a.m. when nobody's there, and because the film is so attentive to those environmental frequencies, when silence arrives, it's loaded. It's the kind of silence that clears a circle around a moment and says, listen, and so you do. And then there are these interludes with Ririn that shine in their modesty, that don't make the mistake of trying to wring adult-level wisdom from a child, instead offering small, honest moments. Like her tracing circles on a fogged window, her habit of doing little checks on her father, 2 taps on his knuckles as a kind of goodbye ritual, a kid's magic thinking that if she repeats it the world won't tilt, and when she starts doing those taps with Paul, the film marks it not with a swell of music but with a breath, the kind of tiny pause that tells you a bridge has been laid without any ceremony. And bridges like that are what make the third act emotionally legible when the plot tightens, because you've seen how trust is built, not demanded, and so when that trust is tested you aren't thinking, movie, you're thinking, people, and that's a really important difference in a story like this, because spectacle is cheap and connection is hard, and this movie pays the cost for the latter gladly, again and again. And I keep replaying a night scene in my mind where Paul returns to the old gym. Not when it's alive with pads thwopping and the tang of sweat in the air, but in the late after hours when the place is ghosted by faint smells and forgotten echoes, and the way the camera moves with him is so gentle, almost apologetic, as if it knows it's bringing a man into a mausoleum of who he used to be, and he walks the ring perimeter with his fingertips, feeling the rope like a blind man reads a line, and we get these soft focus cheek-level shots where you only see pieces, the canvas, a water stain, a dent in a locker door, and in between them these cutaways to his breath fogging in the cool air, and it's a communion, not a training scene, a reckoning, and it culminates not in a flurry of punches but in a knee, a single clean knee to a bag that says I still can, and then he steps back, lowers his head, and whispers something too quiet for us to hear, and the film, bless it, doesn't turn up the volume, it lets that whisper belong to him, which is the kind of artistic humility I respect. Because not everything in a story about brokenness and repair should be legible to us, we are not owed every secret, and by honoring that boundary the film makes the things it does show us feel more intimate rather than less, and so when the story shifts gears again and starts threading the needle between Ben Turtur's blunt force and Ryan Uno's surgical pressure, the scenes have an extra charge, because we understand the personal not as a solipsistic pit but as the bedrock that someone stands on when the world is shaking. And speaking of that needle threading, I'm a fan of how this film refuses to make its villains efficient machines, which too many stories do out of laziness. Here, they are fallible and human and therefore more interesting. Ben's crew mess up, they misread, they argue, they get tired. Ryan's plan hinges on assumptions that aren't perfect, and so they adjust. They get crueler when Grace would be smarter, and you can watch the damage splash back on them, which is satisfying not as revenge porn but as a reminder that entropy visits all. And this choice also grants the heroes margin for improvisation, which is always more compelling than invincibility. There's a sequence where Paul and Vinny attempt to swap, a sort of staged moment in a crowded market where faces blur and shouts stack atop shouts and the smell of fried garlic and exhaust roil together, and the camera doesn't give you aerial clarity, it gives you confusion, bodies moving in parallax, the threat undefined and everywhere, because that's how it feels when you are outnumbered and outplanned, and Paul's micro-choices in that chaos feel like the only thing tethering anyone to safety, a hand signal to Vinny, a subtle repositioning of Ririn so that her small frame is always in the lee of something solid, and it plays like a lesson in risk management under pressure, and there's a grace note at the end where, after the fray, Paul is kneeling to tie Ririn's shoe, his breathing still ragged, his fingers shaking just a fraction as he fumbles the bow, and she places her hand on his shoulder to steady him. And the two of them breathe together for 3 counts, and if your heart doesn't crack a little in that moment, I don't know what to tell you, because the film has earned that tenderness the hard way, by forcing you to care about the ordinary acts that surround extraordinary fear, and from a craft perspective, there's also a confidence to how it deploys its editing rhythms, rarely succumbing to the modern disease of overcutting for fake energy. Instead calibrating the cut to mood, a fast, implacable pattern when panic is appropriate, a floating, almost patient drape when the story wants you to feel time as a weight, and this flexibility is why the film can shift between different kinds of tension without losing its spine. And I want to talk about color again because it's so telling, those clinics where the whites aren't pure, they are a little green, a little exhausted, the streets that glow gold when money is present and bruised blue when it's gone, and then the neutral, workaday grays of corridors and stairwells where most of our lives happen unnoticed, and the way the palate blooms into warmth around small kindnesses, like a shopkeeper handing extra chili without charge, or a neighbor sweeping the stoop earlier than usual to keep an eye on a child in the yard. And those choices aren't incidental, they are part of the film's ethical architecture, suggesting that goodness is often a matter of the most ordinary possible generosity, and that the real heroism, a lot of the time, is the choice to stay, to keep showing up. And while we're in this moral territory, it's valuable to mention that the film doesn't let Paul off the hook, even as it invites us to empathize, is asked to answer for himself by people who matter, not in a court scene, but in a living room, by those who loved him, and in his answer there is no grand speech, only clear-eyed admission and a willingness to do the work without any guarantee of result, and it's telling that the most significant forgiveness he gets isn't framed as a big moment, it's framed as a return to simple interactions, a message replied to, a door left unlocked, a cup set down on the table with a second one beside it, and that's what makes the emotional math of the final act durable rather than flashy. And there's a subthread that I think is easy to miss if you're only watching the fists, which is the way the film treats training as a language, not as a magic potion, how repetition is both solace and potential prison. How the drills that keep you ready can also keep you stuck if you don't change what you're training for, and the film illustrates that with these small shifts in Paul's practice, the way he starts to train to receive rather than to dish out, to deflect and absorb, because protecting someone requires different geometry than defeating someone, and these are subtle changes, but any athlete watching will feel the difference, and even if you're not an athlete, you'll feel the moral resonance of a body learning not to dominate but to shield. And that idea extends beyond the fights into everything, into the ways he moves through rooms, into the way he positions himself in conversations, as a listener, as a buffer, as a person who is willing to eat a little bit of pain so that someone smaller doesn't have to, and it's this gentle evolution that gives the final beats their credibility, because by then he's earned a new set of reflexes, not just performed them once, and in another register. I keep coming back to Vinny because he really is the mirror that the film holds up to Paul in important ways. A father who feels like the world has put him in an unwinnable position, a man whose first instinct is hustle because hustle once saved him, and that instinct is now a liability, and the scenes where he wrestles with Ryan Yuno's artificially narrowed menu of choices feel almost like pressure cooker morality plays, with Ryan making his pitch in that careful, soothing way that someone does when they want to make their violence sound like a favor, and the writing is clever here, giving Ryan enough reasonable-sounding framing that you can feel the lure, that you can see why someone who feels boxed in would consider stepping into a smaller box surrounded by padded walls, and Vinny's eventual move toward defiance, faltering and late though it may be, lands hard because the film made sure we understood the seductive logic he had to wade through to get there, and I have to shout out how cleanly the film handles spatial intelligence too, how aware it is of thresholds, door frames and stairwell landings and alley mouths, and how it uses them as moral devices, moments of decision where stepping over a line is both literal and figurative, and at least twice the film catches a character with their foot hovering, and that hesitation is more revealing than any step they eventually take, and in this way the world they move through is not just backdrop but protagonist, pushing, pulling, offering cover, exposing, and if we widen out to talk about audience reactions as a kind of chorus, I've noticed how viewers respond almost defensively at first. No, it can't be this sad, don't start with a grief that big, and then, if they stay, how they soften into a willingness to be led, and by the end, many are grateful that the film believed they could handle it, that it didn't lie about the scale of loss people carry, and for some, notably those who have walked with their own private disasters, there's relief in the plainness of it, no sanctimony, no cheap absolution, just a recognition that some things break and even if they are mended, the seam remains, and it's okay to live with seams. They are proof of survival, and for those worried about whether the film's somber core might suffocate the action, I think the opposite is true. The action is oxygenated by sorrow, it matters more, it counts, because it isn't frictionless entertainment, it is a dangerous transaction where every move can cost something you can't get back, and that sense of cost sharpens your attention. It makes you watch the way Paul protects his head not just as good technique but as a metaphor for where his priorities have shifted, his guarding, his thinking, his judgment, the part of him that learned from the night everything went wrong. And while we're talking about the past, the film's depiction of the poisoning that kicks off the fall still strikes me as one of its smarter moves, because it refuses to fetishize the villainy of it. It doesn't play the whodunit game, it doesn't make that the arc to be followed for 2 hours, it lets it sit as the ugly piece of context that it is, a way to say that not all failures are moral, some are mechanical, some are chemical, some are orchestrated by people who will never feel the bruise they caused, and the insistence on shifting our attention away from blame hunting and toward repair is part of the film's ethical center, and that ethical center is also what makes the sequences involving the rhesus negative blood so potent without being exploitative. You can feel the research in the detail, you can feel the thought in the way the film articulates scarcity without turning a child into an object. It shows you a system of need and the rotten economies that grow around need when a society doesn't protect its vulnerable, and in doing so, it invites the audience to think about real-world analogues without turning into a lecture, and I appreciate the film for trusting us to connect those dots, and since this is also a review of craft, I should mention the score again, this time in how it ties Ririn and Paul. There's a small motif that only appears when they are within a certain distance of each other, a thread of melody that is not sentimental but is unmistakably theirs, and it does this wonderful thing in the climactic passages where it refuses to rise to a cheap crescendo, instead staying stubbornly hushed, as if the music itself is trying not to frighten the child, and that sense of protection extends into the camera too, which, as I mentioned before, often frames Ririn indirectly, through reflective surfaces, half-open doorways, elongated silhouettes on the ground, and that strategy pays off in a final shot involving her that I won't describe, because it's a gift, but that manages to be both an affirmation and a plea. And while we're here, I've been thinking about how the film positions state power, and it's smart enough not to make the police or the courts either saviors or devils. They are present as institutions that sometimes help, sometimes hinder, often arrive late, often have paperwork that doesn't stretch to cover lived reality. And that ambivalence feels grounded and honest, and it helps frame why someone like Paul might feel that the only justice available is the justice of the body, the justice of being where the danger is and absorbing it, redirecting it. And that is not the same as vigilante worship, and the film knows the difference. It lets that be complex, and in that complexity lies its staying power. And okay, I know I'm gushing, but it's because this film earnestly engages with its material. And that earnestness is a rarity, especially in a marketplace that often rewards irony as a defense mechanism. And if I'm going to nitpick, I could say that one subplot involving a secondary crew member in Ben's orbit feels like it's setting up a larger payoff that gets subsumed by the main plot's urgency. But even that thread offers texture, a glimpse at the pipeline that turns unsupervised boys into men in borrowed jackets barking orders they barely believe in. And that glimpse broadens the film's human map. It reminds us that all of this operates within a larger ecology of hunger and misdirected ambition, and it's crucial that the film holds all of that without letting it drown the primary river of the story, which is Paul's halting, stubborn commitment to do the next right thing for a little girl who isn't his, and that commitment is tested, bent, nearly broken, and in that stress test the film courts despair, and then it lets in a little light, not as a miraculous fix, but as the byproduct of people choosing to be brave in small, unglamorous ways. And I want to tell you about a late scene in a hallway that makes my throat tight just to recall, but I won't, because it is precisely the kind of scene that this film uses to rewire what we think a climax looks like. And saying more would erode it, and perhaps that's the best praise I can give, that a film which could have ended 5 different times in 5 different cathartic blowouts instead ends on a note that is true to life, a note that both closes the story and opens it, because grief, guilt, and love don't stop when a camera cuts. They keep working on us in the quiet hours, and the film signs off in that register, with humility, and I respect it tremendously for that, and from a broader cultural vantage, the impact of a film like Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer in 2026 feels like a marker, a way of saying to the genre, you can be muscular and gentle, kinetic and contemplative, unashamed of your fists and unafraid of your tears, and audiences will come with you if you treat them as participants rather than as targets for content, and based on the waves of word of mouth I'm seeing, based on the way people keep talking not just about what happened but about what it made them feel and think about in their own lives, I'd say the film has landed where it aimed, in that rare space where entertainment and reflection intersect, and if I were to gather a handful of words to describe the experience, I'd choose spare ones: raw, careful, relentless, tender, and I would underline tender, because tenderness is the courage to be kind in a world that rewards hardness, and that's what Paul learns across these hours, to let his hands, trained to break, become tools for shelter, and what a gift that is to witness, and what a powerful thing it is to carry out of a theater or out of your living room. And so yes, this is a high recommendation, not only because the fights are superbly staged, not only because the performances ring with authenticity, not only because the sound and color and movement are all orchestrated with a choreographer's ear for rhythm and a poet's eye for detail, but because it has a heart that beats against your own, and you can feel it sinking if you allow it, and in that sync, something like healing flickers, and maybe that sounds grand, but cinema can do that. It can jolt us into alignment with quieter truths we've been ignoring, and Kehidupan Seorang Kickboxer does it with fists and with a bowl of soup and with a small hand tapping twice on a knuckle to say goodbye. And by now, if you've been listening, you know I'm talking less about cool shots, and more about the way the film uses its cool shots in the service of an ethic, and I think that's where I want to land this extended reflection, with gratitude for a film that doesn't mistake style for soul, but remembers that a ring is just a square painted with rules and that life is the real arena where most of the crucial rounds are fought in kitchens and corridors and outside clinics and in quiet gyms late at night, and in that life, the greatest punch anyone can throw is sometimes the one they don't, the discipline to hold, to redirect, to stay, and when the final image folds into credits. If you find yourself sitting in the gentle murmur of your own room thinking about who you need to protect, or who you owe an apology to, or how you might carry your own grief without letting it turn into a weapon in your hands, then the film has done more than entertain you, it has met you, and that meeting is rare and real, and for that, I'm grateful, and as always, if you find yourself wanting to talk about it, this space is for that too, because movies like this aren't just watched, they are metabolized, and if a former champion's attempt to be a better man can echo inside your choices tomorrow, then the story keeps fighting long after the bell, and that, to me, is the point.